Let's review the characteristics of fascism. We're going to use this Encyclopedia Britannica article to help us out a little bit, and I actually want to start by reading a little bit directly from the article. So I'm here in the Encyclopedia Britannica article in the section called Common Characteristics of Fascist Movements. And if you look down, there are quite a few subsections here, which essentially form a list of the common characteristics of fascist movements. So things like opposition to Marxism, opposition to parliamentary democracy, etc., all the way down to sexism and misogyny. But I want to start with this overview section and point out a few things here. So the section starts out by saying, there has been considerable disagreement among historians and political scientists about the nature of fascism. And they give some examples of kind of how different groups have conceptualized fascism differently. So this is setting us up to understand that fascism is a contested topic. It's controversial and it depends on how you define it. The nature of what it is depends on how you define it. And then if I scroll down a little bit further here, I want to point out this section. Scholars of fascism themselves bring to their studies different political and cultural attitudes, which often have a bearing on the importance they assign to one or another aspect of fascist ideology or practice. So this is a fancy way of saying that scholars have biases, and that determines how they conceptualize fascism. And so once again, it's a contested topic or a controversial topic. And then they give some examples. Secular liberals, for example, have stressed fascism's religious roots. Roman Catholic and Protestant scholars have emphasized its secular origins. Social conservatives have pointed to its socialist and populist aspects, and social radicals have noted its defensive capitalism and elitism. So basically, every group wants to depict fascism in a way that is negative towards their opposing group and positive towards themselves. For these and other reasons, there is no universally accepted definition of fascism. Nevertheless, it is possible to identify a number of general characteristics that fascist movements between 1922 and 1945 tended to have in common. So, no universally accepted definition, but we're going to try, basically, to identify some common characteristics. And then they have the list of characteristics here. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these today. I have picked a few of them that I think are particularly important, and I'm going to focus on those. So without further ado, let's take a look at this table here. So on the left hand of this table, we have some characteristics of fascism. The very first one, "we was robbed," is taken from Dr. Markowitz's descriptions of fascism in lecture. The rest of these come from the Encyclopedia Britannica article, although of course Dr. Markowitz has discussed many of these in lecture as well. So I'm going to go through briefly and compare Germany and Japan in this regard. And if you're curious to learn more about any of these things, the sources are at the bottom of the slide. You might find these useful for a future paper. So let's start with this idea of "we was robbed." Dr. Markowitz has talked about this in lecture, and it's basically the idea that a country has lost some former glory. It used to be great. It used to have certain larger expanses of territory. It used to have more money, and someone has taken that away from the country. So they have been robbed of their glory. In both Germany and Japan, the Treaty of Versailles was an important turning point that started this "we was robbed" narrative in the countries. So both countries after the Treaty of Versailles were limited in the amount of military preparations or militarization that their country could have. In Japan, this involved strict limits on the amount of shipbuilding that the country could do. So Japan's main industrial pursuit was naval shipbuilding, but this was viewed as a military threat. So after the Treaty of Versailles, this activity was limited by the other countries that were party to the treaty. In the case of Germany, they had to cede some contested territories and were basically eviscerated economically by the Treaty of Versailles. And this is where we get to the stories about Germans having to bring a wheelbarrow of cash to purchase a loaf of bread. Basically, after the country lost the war, they were put in a very bad economic and political situation, very subservient to the rest of Europe, and people resented this. The second thing we have here is opposition to parliamentary democracy. So both in Germany and Japan, we saw an erosion of democracy and then eventually an all-out dictatorship. So in Germany, the big turning point was the Enabling Act of 1933. This took place after the Nazi Party had already gained power in the legislature, and then the legislature passed this Enabling Act, which essentially gave Hitler, the Führer, power to enact laws without getting permission from the legislature first. So it's almost like the legislature crippled or eliminated itself and gave total power to Hitler, the dictator. In Japan, the turning point was the assassination of the prime minister, and I'm actually going to switch to a Wikipedia article here. So this Wikipedia article has a list of the prime ministers of Japan. You notice that in this period that I'm looking at on the screen, which is kind of the early 1900s, there were, different prime ministers from various political parties. So these colored columns indicate political party of the prime minister. So that, looks fine and looks like democracy is happening. Then you get to Inukai Tsuyoshi, and I'm probably mispronouncing the name, but this is the prime minister who was assassinated in 1932. And notice that after this prime minister, so after the assassination of Tsuyoshi, suddenly we switch. We no longer have political parties here, but it basically just says military for quite a while, pretty much until you get here to this political party. But if I mouse over this, I can see that it was actually the Empire of Japan's wartime organization, which means it wasn't really a political party, still an extension of the military dictatorship. And so it's not until 1945 here that we get a real political party in power. And this was because of American intervention in Japan at the end of World War II. So the point here is that the assassination of Inukai Tsuyoshi was a turning point at which Japan became a military dictatorship and no longer a parliamentary democracy. So the next thing we have is conservative economic programs. In both countries, this took the form of industrialization and a focus on producing products domestically. And the industrialization was particularly geared towards wartime preparation. So in Germany, we have cases like the auto manufacturers, the construction of the Autobahn, the creation of synthetic rubber was an important military industrial development that took place. And in Japan, they turned again to naval shipbuilding and basically began to ramp up their shipbuilding efforts in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. So industrialization in that in that regard, military industrialization. And I do want to kind of pause and make a point here about the Nazi Party. So the full name of the Nazi Party is NSDAP, which translates in English to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. But I want to make a point here about the inclusion of the word socialist in the party's name. That is definitely a little bit of a misnomer. So the Nazi Party did not engage in many socialist policies. They didn't do any kind of radical redistribution of wealth. The redistribution of wealth that did take place mostly involved taking wealth away from Jews in Germany and redistributing that wealth to elites in the Nazi Party. And so I really think that socialist is a misnomer within the title of the Nazi Party. The next thing we have is another economic policy, which is corporatism. And I'm going to talk for a minute about the situation with trade unions. So in Japan, trade unions had been weak up to this fascist period. And this was partly a cultural thing. There was quite a bit of trust in management in Japan. And so this sort of combative relationship between workers and bosses just didn't emerge. So because of that, when the military dictatorship gained power, they didn't really have to deal with trade unions in any way. This was not the case in Germany. Germany did have a trade union movement, and when Hitler came to power, he outlawed these trade unions, and then he eventually replaced them with sort of state-sponsored trade unions. And this is the idea of corporatism, which is that companies are sort of highly centralized and in partnership with the government, and we don't want to have these independent trade unions that can just kind of do what they want. We want everyone working together. In the case of Germany, the goal was a ramp up of the military industrial complex in order to reclaim German territories, well, territories that were perceived as German. And that brings me to the next characteristic, which is imperialism. Both Germany and Japan engaged in imperialism during their fascist periods. In Germany, this is very famous because it's essentially the beginning of World War II. So Anschluss simply means annexation, but it is sometimes used in a historically specific way to refer to the German invasion of Austria, then followed by Czechoslovakia, then followed by Poland, and thus World War II began. These territories were perceived as being part of the German nation. They had German speakers in them, and I believe in the case of Austria, the German population had even voted at one time that they wanted to separate from Austria and join Germany. But they were not territorially part of Germany at the time. So this was an invasion of another territory to try and claim lands that were perceived as being German. In the case of Japan, imperialism took place in mainland Asia. So the Second Sino-Japanese War was a war between China and Japan. Japan invaded Manchuria, and this was actually quite a brutal war. And Japan did not, I don't know if, so in the case of Germany, we can use the term irredentism to describe what they did, because the lands that they invaded were perceived as being part of a German homeland. In the case of Japan, I don't think the term irredentism applies. Imperialism, yes. Irredentism, I'm not so sure. They didn't perceive, my understanding is that they didn't perceive mainland China as being part of a nation of Japan. Rather, they simply wanted to exploit the resources of mainland China. Next, we have mass mobilization. In Germany, we've all seen photographs or even video footage of this. There were these mass rallies in which Hitler would speak. There was the Heil Hitler salute, and there were organizations such as the Hitler Youth, and people would congregate in large groups to support the Nazi Party. In Japan, from what I can find, there was no corresponding mass mobilization. There was military mobilization, but the general people, I don't think they participated in rallies on the same scale as Germany. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the next topic, which is the leadership principle. This is the idea that under fascism, we want a strong, charismatic leader to make decisions for the people. Germany obviously had this in the form of Adolf Hitler, but in the case of Japan, it's a little bit unclear if there was such a charismatic leader. The emperor at the time was Hirohito. I have not seen him described as being especially charismatic. The prime minister for some of this period was Tojo. I have seen some descriptors of his being charismatic, but I don't think it was on the same level as Adolf Hitler, and I don't think we saw the same mass mobilization and rallies in Japan as in Germany. Next, we have violence. So certainly both countries engaged in violence during their fascist period. In Germany, of course, we have the example of the Holocaust, and in Japan, we have events like the Nanking Massacre, which took place during the Second Sino-Japanese War and involved the death of an estimated 300,000 Chinese, and raping and looting as well. So there was certainly violence and glorification of violence in both countries. And then finally, going along with violence, scapegoating. So in Germany, the people who were targeted by the Holocaust, so people who were placed in concentration camps and in some cases ultimately exterminated, were scapegoated and blamed for the problems or perceived weaknesses of the German state. These included, first and foremost, Jews, and then other smaller groups like leftists, Marxists, the Roma, and the LGBTQ community in Germany were all scapegoated as seen as weaknesses in the German nation. In Japan, this also may be a little bit of a historical question. I don't think scapegoating occurred to the same degree as it did in Germany. Certainly leftists were rounded up by the military dictatorship and executed or imprisoned. And the Chinese people were certainly stigmatized, seen as less than by the Japanese during this period. And in fact, all other mainland Asian ethnicities or countries were seen as less than by the Japanese. So there was sort of this perceived racial hierarchy. I'm not sure it was to the same degree as the Holocaust with the Jews. And so whether we want to make that comparison, I think is a question that you can decide for yourself.